Well, thank you very much, Mr. Lamb. Came out in 1951. It was rather amusingly supposed that I had calculated for it to come out on the 250th anniversary of the founding of Yale. In fact, that was coincidental. No, not conceivably. Well, the book was an examination of life at Yale for the undergraduate, with special attention given to the impulses in the courses to which he was exposed, having to do with government. Was it enthusiasm for greater government, or was it enthusiasm for less government, and also in respect of religion, i.e., what was encouraged in those courses in which religion touched faith or skepticism. And I concluded that Yale's teaching in those days was collectivist in its impulses, in its economic impulses, and agnostic in respect of the other. Shall I rattle on, or do you want to? As recently as 4 years ago at a reunion, someone who is now a Protestant minister, who became a Protestant minister, reminded me that I had volunteered to read aloud the section that bore on Christianity to Dwight Hall. Dwight Hall is sort of the fraternity of Christian-minded young men, and he said, I regret to tell you that everything you said was proved correct, by which he meant that the gradual sort of disappearance of a strong Christian faith was accurately predicted on the basis of his knowledge of what went on and what subsequently happened. It wasn't an enormous sully. It got a lot of attention. He had 3 reviews, for instance, in the Saturday Review of Literature, which was in those days what one mostly read when deciding what books to buy. There, of course, has been out in paperback, I'd guess, under 100,000. That came out in 1954. It's a book written at the high pitch of the McCarthy movement by Brent Bozell and me. He was doing his last year at the Yale Law School, and I had just pulled out of the CIA and was making my way as an independent writer. And we looked into the whole McCarthy question. In 1954, the country was enormously pro-McCarthy, and especially those elements of the country that were mobilized on the McCarthy, on the communist issue. We closed the book in September of 1953, and as I subsequently recalled in a novel, most of his really crazy mistakes were done later rather than earlier, with one important exception. So the book is a very good resource for anybody who's interested in the tidings hearings. In fact, when Whittaker Chambers wrote to the publisher, Henry Reagan, he said, "That's why I want the book, because I want solid research on the tidings hearings." They were the great question mark during that period of McCarthy's life, but they completely disappeared when the Army charges came along, and that proved to be the battlefield over which McCarthy fight was fought. Well, that book was written in 1958 to 59, and what it attempted to do was to distill what I thought were the postulates of American liberalism, and hold them up to the scrutiny of events, and ask, really, shouldn't we move up from liberalism in the direction of political realism and in the direction of policies that were more successful? Well, John Dos Passos was a rather spectacular leftist during the 30s. He was a socialist and a utopian. And he came around on that and shocked his huge constituency by becoming conservative. So when I suggested to him that he might consent to write the foreword, he rather enthusiastically agreed to do so. And that was that. A happy communion. Yeah, I used to get around New York for a while on a scooter, and this particular photographer shot that, and a few others for some magazine, and the publisher liked it. Now that book came out as the first, I think, the first of my collections, and was very successful. It happened to come out at a moment when there was a lot of publicity being given to my exchanges with Gore Vidal on the political conventions, and that probably had something to do with its success. What it is a collection of material which in 1958 I thought there'd be a market for and would make a good book. I try to keep a bound copy, but maybe I've missed up on one or two. That's a rare book. That's the second of my collections. That has in it a long essay I wrote on Whittaker Chambers when he died, incorporating material that he had sent me, which subsequently evolutionized into a book of its own. That particular essay was published in Esquire magazine and got a fair amount of attention. You know, beyond saying somebody who dislikes me from one of many legitimate reasons, huffed in his review that Rumbles is a perfect title for Mr. Buckley's book, since that's really all that he is engaged in. He's the street fights. Almost all in Switzerland, with the exception of 2 or 3. I have a routine which takes me to Switzerland, and at the end of January, and I sit down and write my books. 6 weeks, 6, 7 weeks. I read today in the New York Times an article by Andrew Sullivan in which he talks about testosterone, and he says that he's used it. Now he's HIV positive, and perhaps that was a reason he did it. But he says in it that ever since he used it, his energy level is completely back to normal. He's not talking obviously about sexual energy level. So I thought, well, that might be a good thing to investigate. At my age, maybe I can write 2 books a year. Well, I find writing hard, by which I mean I'm not in the company of those who look forward to writing. John Chamberlain, the eminent critic who died 7 or 8 years ago, very, very shy, utterly without affectation. He told me that one time, several years before, he'd had a hard time sleeping. And he couldn't understand why, because he was very sound, normal. About 3 o'clock in the morning, he woke up, and he realized he hadn't written anything that day. So he got up, went to his desk, pulled out his typewriter, and wrote an essay or something, and went back to sleep. I know a few people like that, whose need to write can be compared to some people's need to eat or to take exercise. I don't have that. I just think it's terribly, terribly hard, sweaty work. And happily I write quickly, in part, no doubt, to contract the pain. I write on a computer, since they existed, a Royal typewriter. And then I never wrote by pencil, not since college. I was the editor of my school paper, so I had to write editorial every day. And for the first week or 2, I would write by hand, but then went right to a typewriter, which I think most people do. Depends on the deadline, but my book writing routine is to start writing at 4:30 in the afternoon. which gives you time to ski before that and to do your regular work in the morning. No, well, she broke her leg rather badly in 1965, so she hasn't skied since then. So I got to do that on my own. I had a long flu. This is terribly boring, accounts of one's illnesses, but I had a cranky flu that didn't immobilize me, but made it almost impossible to ski. Just sort of withered the limbs. I was pulling out of it by the time I got out. That's a wonderful book. I was asked by Nixon to be a public member of the United Nations in 1973, so I did. It's about 2.5 months assignment. And I decided, well, in order to justify this terrible dissipation of time and effort, I must write about it. So I looked for a bibliography by the United Nations. Nothing had ever been written about it except a book by a photographer in the Brazilian delegation. The reason being primarily that the UN was such a bore. So I wrote this book, and I sent it to the New Yorker, and it was accepted right away. I wish I had let them publish it, but they said, Mr. Sean said they'd have to delay this publication by 6 months. So I pulled it out and published it in the normal way. It's a really interesting book because it was at the height of the Cold War, plus also it was at the moment in which Pinochet took over in Chile, plus also it was the 3-Day War. So there was a pretty exciting time, September of 1973. Well, I wrote about it at the time that it was the most extraordinary and concentrated deposit of prejudice and hypocrisy in the history of civilization. Everyone knew that the spokesman from East Germany was going to simply say what he was told to say in Moscow. Everybody knew that this spokesman from Saudi Arabia would challenge the credentials of Israel using pretty much language they used the last 25 years. Everybody referred to each other with this exaggerated deference. It was a pretty ugly sight. At the same time, one recognized that certain arrangements are expedited by having any international body. You know, you got to know where your right to transmit a radio beam ends and mine begins. So for stuff like that, it was useful. I remember making the suggestion at the time that what the United States ought to do, this was important and much less important now, was never ever to vote in the General Assembly. Argue, plead, cajole, threaten, all of those things, but never vote. Because the minute you vote and you lose the vote, you subscribe to the superstition that the democratic process should be listened to, even when it is completely athwart truth and morality. My suggestion was not taken. What did happen, of course, was that people ignored the General Assembly vote. Gradually, the power accumulated in the Security Council, and where it pretty much rests today. Well, that was a pretty interesting book because I decided to run for mayor of New York on the Conservative Party ticket in 1965. My point being that the Republican candidate John Lindsay was trying to forward ideas indistinguishable from those being forwarded by the Democratic candidate. So I did run. It was a rather dramatic occasion, in part because there was a newspaper strike. As a result of that newspaper strike, which lasted 7 or 8 weeks, all the exchanges were done on television. And that way, John Lindsay and A-Beam and I had sort of equal time. And that gave exposure to my positions which would not have been had if routine newspaper accounts were given to them. So it was an extremely jolly and interesting opportunity to try to express conservative views on urban problems. I was, in a sense, prophetic in that I kept insisting that John Lindsay was really a Democrat. Well, he became a Democrat 5 years later, having been defeated for renomination on the Republican Party. I tried to acknowledge people who were important to me, personally or professionally. There's wide variety, obviously, because you know, the business of if you name anybody, you got to forget to name somebody else is depressing. So that you end up, say, with 40 dedications, you find out you forgot your own mother, let's say. So that's the problem. It's largely impulsive to who sort of comes to mind when time comes to do the dedication. I met her at Vassar when she was a freshman, and I was a sophomore. No, she was a sophomore. I was a freshman. I was a veteran, so I was being. And then we sort of renewed our courtship. I guess it then began in Vancouver. She's from Vancouver. She lived across the way in Vassar from my sister, Tish Moselle. So it matured, and that was 50 years ago. Right reason. That's another of my collections. I'm trying to think of the dominant piece in it, if there is one. Oh yeah, this is worth saying about it. It's the first one of my collections which I asked somebody else to edit. You know, well, I don't have to tell you, to read everything that you've written in the last 7 years, if you write reggae, is an enormous task. And so I asked Rick Brookhiser, at that point a junior associate, now a highly acclaimed biographer, to do me the favor of singling out the material that sort of appealed to him. So he had the dreary job of reading it all. It launched in November of 1955. I'm an editor at large of the magazine. Yes, I do. I resigned as editor in 1990. No. Yeah, it does. But only in the sense that you're bothered if you're in a hospital that doesn't make money, or a school that doesn't make money. We are an educational effort primarily, and for that reason, absorb the vicissitudes of a philanthropic / editorial enterprise. Oh yeah, Roger Milken, one of my dearest old friends and a supporter of the magazine. We differ now on he's very pronounced in his belief in protectionism, which I'm not. But the great thing to say about him is, notwithstanding that difference, he doesn't withdraw his advertisement in National Review. Spartanburg, South Carolina. Yeah, one company, when we attacked the John Birch Society, stopped its advertising. But there's been, this may interest you. When the idea of the magazine came up, the idea was Willy Schlamm. Willy Schlamm was a Viennese intellectual who had come to America. He became very close to Henry Luce. And when he left the Luce apparatus, he became one of the 3 editors of the Freeman, which was a conservative fortnightly. And it had 17 trustees. And they were always meeting and disagreeing on such issues as whether the magazine should back Taft or Eisenhower for the presidency. So it was his idea that I start a magazine. He said the absolutely important administrative thing is to keep all the voting shares. because if you have all the voting shares, the magazine may prosper or it may not prosper. But if it destructs, it won't be on account of people staying up till 3 o'clock in the morning trying to decide who has the votes. And it's extraordinary how tranquil life can be if it is known who makes these decisions. So we don't get a situation where advertisers call up and say we demand this or the other, or editors. Now, you have to use your authority cautiously and persuasively, which obviously I would say, maybe I should write a book about that. I don't. I just didn't proofread that carefully. The Yale-style books that always eliminate the comma, and I was influenced by it because it was the first style book by which I was governed. If you want to construct a logic for it, you can do that by saying that your name is William F. Buckley Jr. It's not William F. Buckley, comma, Jr. as an appositive. No. People can introduce books without being ideological soulmates. It happens, this is interesting, Alistair Cook wrote a long review of one of my books in the Washington Post, 1971, full page. And it was a very nice review, so I wrote him and said, maybe we should meet. Well, we've had lunch every 3 months for the last 30 years, all traceable to that. He's become very conservative on certain issues, extremely, but he would not be a conservative in the national view sense. He is 97. I'm sorry, he's 91. He's exactly the same age as John Kenneth Galbraith. He still plays golf. He had a little bout of pneumonia type thing this winter, but I expect to be seeing him in the next couple of weeks. Flying Land began in 1966. It had been scheduled to start in 1965, but the fact that I was running for mayor disqualified it. It was thought that it would last 13 weeks. And the idea was to have sort of confrontational exercises with conspicuous liberals. It was quite successful. In fact, it was very successful. So it was renewed another 13 weeks. And anyway, finally, I ended up saying I don't want to go any longer. And I killed it at the end of the millennium, i.e. the last show was run in December of 1999, after 33 years. Well, because I felt that things have to end. The way I put it was I didn't want to die on stage. Things do have to end, and it's not a bad idea to pick a propitious moment to let it end. I didn't think I was running out of gas particularly. Also, it was a strain to get it financed because, as you of all people know, public broadcasting stations don't like to pay for anything, so they want everything free, and which meant that the entire overhead of Flying Land had to be provided by us. Well, I'm a Catholic, a believing Catholic and Christian, and it kept sort of creeping up on me that I felt that I should realize an obligation to write about my faith, both to express gratitude for it and to and pass along certain points that I found persuasive over the years. It's to my mother, Eloise Steiner Buckley. She died at age 90 and was a very devout, marvelous woman. I wish you had known her. Well, she was from New Orleans. She was sort of a beauty, had 10 children, and had sort of a twittery way, plenty of steel there, deferred in almost all situations to my father, who was the paterfamilias. On the other hand, everybody who saw the scene knew that she was life was pretty much as she dictated. She was a total Southerner, and we lived we were brought up in Europe and in Connecticut. Connecticut was our home. But along around 1936, my father bought a place in South Carolina in Camden, and that's where they're both buried. He was a Texan, and they were very sort of Southern-oriented. Yeah, that's taken from that's a phrase in the Old Testament that you know, if the Lord, things shall be as the governor listeth, as the Lord desires or specifies, and there's a lot of fun stuff in that book. In fact, there's a lot of fun stuff in all these books. You know, I do, but it's a book that hasn't quite been published yet. It's a book on my speeches, very carefully selected. You know, 150,000 words out of 500,000. Everything I have to say is there. Beginning with the speech I gave as a senior at Yale at commencement time, to the speech I gave here in Washington for the Heritage Society, celebrating their 25th anniversary. It's been rather nicely greeted. People find it interesting and amusing and historically important. There are tons of blurbs, by the way. That book was sent by the publisher rather ingeniously to a dozen or so people, and they shot back with terrific stuff. Even George McGovern says it's a wonderful book. How you like that? Who said that? Gee whiz, maybe we'll have to crank George up for another run. He's a lovely man. Well, that book's about Joe McCarthy. The 40 years after writing the first one, I thought that the whole McCarthy scene really needs to be explicated as a novel, so that you can say things you know to have been true and know to have been revealing, which got left out in the cross antagonisms of the journalistic approach to the problem back then. I think it's a very, very effective novel, and I was delighted, which I saw only yesterday, by the review of it by Richard Gid Powers. He's very anti-McCarthy, also a student of close war, and he thinks that the portraiture in that book is very important and readable. 12. Actually 13. I think it's generally it's easier to write a novel because there's marginally less research. On the other hand, you know, if you decide you're going to write the book in 6 weeks, you do, and you get the research lined up, and but the wonderful thing about a novel is the temptation to improvise. You know, you finish at 7 o'clock, and the guy doesn't know that the killer is coming in the other way. So something has to happen, and you've got to make it you got to make the surprise relevant. You know, if you have a high threshold of boredom, which I do, you tend not to write boring things because you bore yourself. You know, some people can write 6 pages on the wisteria trees, and I love them for it. Eudora Welty, for instance. I can't do that, and any attempt to do so cripples me. And for that reason, I like to think that none of my books is boring. Well, the answer to that is easy. I'm not good enough. In fact, I played the harpsichord at a Yale reunion 4 or 5 years ago. I played the D minor concerto and anyway, it was recorded, and I heard it. I made so many mistakes that I vowed I would never, ever play it in public. But on the matter of not writing about music, it's a very special challenge. The very first writing I ever did was as music critic for the Lakeville Journal. At age 15, I went to all the chamber music concerts they call it Music Mountain. And I published every week for a couple of years. But somewhere along the line, two things happened. Number one, I recognized that my knowledge of music was really superficial. I was the total consumer, and I didn't have the authority to write about it structurally in any convincing way. And secondly, I faced a problem that some people simply transcend, which is there's no way to communicate the beauty of music through writing. And therefore, under the circumstances, there's kind of a barrenness in the effort, which is itself, I think, rather depressing. That's well, that implies or should imply no lack of gratitude for the gentility of whoever gave you the key. It's just an aspect of forgetfulness. Well, there are a lot of references, especially in political seasons, to the Catholic vote. And by that is most often meant people whose parents are Irish or Italians or Poles or whatever. And in that sense, the word is used without sort of doctrinal severity. And by practical Catholic, I meant that I attempt to live and be governed by unsuccessfully by the code, so that how should we do this? I heard somebody told me the other day that 18% of Catholics attend church every week. Now, to fail to attend church is a mortal sin. So that that kind of lackadaisical attention to the Sabbath suggests an informality to the religion, which I find saddening. I think that's because the constituency to which the Conservatives appeal is less transitory, by which I mean that I understand Conservatives as attempting to revive and to celebrate a criteria that don't merely justify, that aren't merely described by fitful democratic acts. It was Burke who referred to as the democracy of the dead, the allegiance that we feel or ought to feel to a number of decisions that were made even before we were born that orient or seek to orient society. Most notable of these, of course, is the Constitution of the United States and the Bill of Rights. Well, Malcolm Muggeridge, as you may recall, was brought up a Christian and then left the faith and rediscovered it. He was, quote, reborn, to use a modern terminology, and he did so with the most marvelous enthusiasm. He spoke about Christianity much as one might speak about My Fair Lady the first time you saw it on Broadway, and that enthusiasm plus his marvelous powers of expressing himself, as done in many essays and a couple of books, attracted me enormously. We became very close friends, and he asked to be on Firing Line. This for the 6th time. He said, "I want to have a Firing Line called Why I Am Not a Catholic." I said, "Okay." So we did, and 2 years later he became a Catholic, and we had yet another final Firing Line done in his little home in Wiltshire, I think it was, and there was a kind of a augustness in him. He had a face that looked like the face of the clown in 17th century and 18th century drama. but his passion for the relevance of Christianity is shown through it. It is, by the way, I think it's a program that the producer ran every year at Christmas time for the last 10 or 12 years. And people were clamorous to see it again. Obviously, it won't run anymore, but that's undoubtedly the program this gentleman was talking about. The television, the Museum of Television and Radio, over here on 52nd Street, 51st Street, yeah. They have 150 of them. Well, that's very nice of you. I appreciate that a lot. I wish I could read or hear what it was that I said in 1972 and see if there's anything that survives the time that I could quote to you now. On the matter of the race in New York, I'm not very much impressed by the notion that Mrs. Clinton is an outsider. She's a very cosmopolitan woman, and Bobby Kennedy was formerly an outsider. My brother Jim was formerly an outsider. So I think that if people who want to vote the other side can't come up with a better argument for doing so than that, she has a chance. Her husband's legacy is going to take a lot of straightening out. My offhand feeling about him is that he never had he's never spoken a memorable word, and probably has never had a memorable thought. And under the circumstances, that will certainly be a time for improvisation. But one doesn't feel like precipitating a funeral at this stage of the game. Gratitude was prompted by my feeling that we take a lot for granted. Years ago, I set out to write a book on Ortega y Gasset, which I didn't conclude. But I remembered most keenly about Ortega y Gasset that he said that the fingerprint of the mass man, now this, I'm talking about a book written in 1932, is the lack of any appreciation of what it is that we get for nothing. And that prompted me to write this book, urging that there be some expression of how much we owe. And I came out very explicitly for a year's service. A year's service helping people in hospitals, helping to teach children who are illiterate, helping to in the environment. Interestingly enough, I cavilled at making it obligatory, but I was very enthusiastic about the idea of helping an ethos materialize, which said to the 22-year-old, look, if you haven't done a year of national service, don't come around, because I think you ought to do that. Pretty much the way the Mormons affect their tithing. And I learned, I've never confirmed this, that the idea appealed to one trustee of Harvard who actually presented it at a meeting of the trustees, saying, well, what do you think? What if Harvard were to say, we won't take anybody as a freshman who has not a year of public service? Well, if Harvard did it, then everybody else would do it eventually. So I very much encouraged that idea in gratitude. It never got off the ground, and Milton Friedman was furious with me. The notion that you can have an ethos which isn't backed by government power and still be persuasive is resisted. People say, well, if government isn't behind it and it doesn't work, what do you then do? To which I reply, well, ethos can be egged along, and this is what should happen. I don't know that there is one plan that's sort of on the drawing board, and the ISI, the Intercollegiate Society, of studies has its own, and we are governed pretty much by the same criteria. So I would probably recommend that you go there if we don't come out soon with our new version. I know that he is alive, and I know that he is not active, which is inconceivable, given his enormous energy and diligence. So it must be that he's a little bit incapacitated. I think so. Yeah. And he wrote a book every year, and he was always on firing line. He was a marvelous explicator. So I very much miss him, and recommend his books. Yes, that was a mammoth bestseller, surprise bestseller, and gave him both a name and kind of a financial independence, which at that time was very important to him. You know, I don't remember that quote. Oh, gee whiz. It's extraordinary what one sentence or lack of it can do to you. The question of how many people McCarthy damaged is it's never easy to answer. In this big book, The Unmaking of a Mayor, Bozell and I investigated that charge and came to the conclusion that the people whom he had named were by no means people with utterly clean records. Owen Lattimore, for instance, in my opinion, was exactly what he was named by the committee, a conscious, articulate instrument of the Soviet conspiracy. If what the people that McCarthy hurt most enduringly, in my judgment, is people like me, the anti-communist community. As Richard Gid Powers says, the damage he did to the anti-communist movement was enormous. Even today, if anybody makes any criticism of somebody's conduct or record of foreign policy, the fastest way to shut them up is to say, well, that's McCarthyite reasoning, and people wince. But I don't think that there are all that many people who, on account of McCarthy, suffered in a sense that they didn't deserve so. Look, if I come out for the Ku Klux Klan, and 7 or 8 years from now somebody's running against me for office, they say, well, he's a guy who belongs to the Ku Klux Klan. Even assuming I've completely reformed, the fact that it is said about my background is not itself unjust. And these Hollywood characters who defended Joe Stalin and defended the trials, and 7 years or 8 years later were confronted with it, they might have been completely liberated from that kind of temptation, but they didn't, in my judgment, win immunity from its being brought up. Well, if what you're saying is that the consequences that the consequences of defying a social position can be overstretched, the answer is I completely agree with you. In Salem, they started burning witches at some point. This was a preposterous and tragic over-consequence. But the effort to suggest that this was reflected in McCarthyism, in my judgment, doesn't square with the experience. I remember one man on television saying that McCarthy's effort to shut him up would not prevail. Well, there was never any question about his being shut up. Now, if somewhere down the line you find a professor in some university who didn't get promoted because the trustees said he belonged to the Soviet-American Friendship League, the answer is that kind of thing does happen, just as it can happen that somebody is accused of anti-woman prejudice because he voted against Title VII of the Civil Rights Code. But to reach back and seek to discredit a movement that gave us correct perspectives, I think is not to be. There was the big struggle in political history right after the war was to reconcile our enthusiasm for our partner, Joseph Stalin, and our acknowledgement that he ran a terrible, despotic machine. Now, the politics of 1945, 46, 47, and 48 were very, very much influenced by people who said, you got to come out on the side of peace. You got to recognize that the Soviet Union is working out its own way towards socialism, and yeah, you got to break a few eggs before you can scramble them, etc., etc. America fought clean of that around 1948-49 with the conviction of Hiss, with the loss of Czechoslovakia, with the detonation of the bomb, with the war in Korea, with the loss of China, and having fought themselves through that, becoming a fellow traveler was not as easy a way to go as it had been, and that was welcome. But McCarthy screwed things up by going so far as to discredit those necessary distinctions. In 1992, a lot of allegations were swirling about on the general theme of anti-Semitism. It was charged, for instance, that Pat Buchanan was anti-Semitic based on certain things he had said. It was charged that the Dartmouth Review was anti-Semitic as a result of a couple of things that had published. I thought it a good idea to explore those points at sort of mini book length, and so I did. Just as one of our callers thought it important to distinguish a position that is soft on communism over against one that simply wants to a revision in foreign policy. I think it's extremely important with anti-Semitism to make those distinctions. A lot of conservatives were associated with anti-Semitism during the 20s and 30s. In fact, anti-Semitism was pretty much a way of life in practice. When I was a freshman at Yale, there had yet to be one Jewish member of the faculty with tenure. Paul Weiss, I think, was the first. So an effort to launder anti-Semitism out of the conservative position was an effort that I engaged in, and this book goes over that ground and seeks to make, I think, the relevant points. Priscilla is a niece. Priscilla Buckley, married, living in Paris, and John Buckley was lives in Washington and played a very prominent role in the presidential election as a press aide for Kemp a couple of years ago. Chris was 47, and he's a smashing good thing. He's my only child. I think that it's one of the forces of nature we have to contend with. The critical community tends to get its life and its inspiration from the temptation to criticize, not so much the establishment narrowly viewed, but the establishment broadly viewed. There was a poll published two or 3 years ago that said that between 75 and 80% of the people engaged in television journalism had voted Democratic in the last election. When I was at Yale, a professor to whom I was very attached disclosed a poll taken of tenured professors in the Department of Political Science. There were 23 of them. Question, Dewey or Truman? 23 Truman, Dewey, none. One doesn't really have to recite data of this kind because it's sort of uniformly known that by and large the academic media and the television and radio and the journalists are liberal, defined as Democrat versus Republican. No, I never did. I wish I had. Hannah Arendt was an important philosophical analyst. Her most conspicuous work, I think, probably was her coverage of the Eichmann trial, in which she formulated the phrase the banality of evil, and distressed a lot of people who wanted her to stress the singularity of the Holocaust rather than simply explain it as one more expression of the hideous capacity of human beings. But she, the answer is I never did run into her, and she became a little bit eccentric. I have not read her exchanges with Mary McCarthy, which have been published as a book. The Montpellier Society. Montpellier is an alpine peak, and they rounded up a few free marketers who had survived the war, and they founded a society there. I think it was 44, 45. Hayek was perhaps its founding president. Hayek was very influential. Oddly enough, he was influential also as a journalist. His book, am I forgetting the name of the book? Yeah, The Road to Serfdom, thanks, was actually serialized in the Reader's Digest, even though it's a pretty heady book intellectually. And then 20 years later, he wrote The Constitution of Liberty, which is an extremely important, trenchant philosophical case made for freedom. Now, he got the Nobel Prize not for these accomplishments, but for some technical accomplishments that he had undertaken when he taught in London during the 30s. He went on to the University of Chicago when he became an American, and there they wouldn't give him a tenured seat. It was sort of odd in context of the University of Chicago that he never got tenure in Chicago. I remember giving a speech at his 70th birthday and his 75th birthday, but those wonderful people live forever. Friedman lived forever, von Mises lived forever. There's had an equivalent impact. Well, Henry Hazlitt had an enormous impact. I don't think he was a PhD, but his book Economics in One Lesson was hailed by a lot of important economists as a marvelous rudimentary expression of the free market idea. I wrote a long essay on Vidal, which was published in '69 in Esquire, and that's all I will ever say about him. I don't see him now. Well, in my experience, most universities have a vocal conservative dissent. For instance, at Yale, there's a magazine called the Yale Free Press. Very lively, extremely good, and it comes out every month or so. The Dartmouth has the Dartmouth Review, which is a weekly. There's the Harvard Salient. So in every situation, there is there tends to be an expressive voice of dissent. You might ask the question, why should they be dissenters rather than people who are the acknowledged spokesman of the community? The answer is that life seems to be unfair about that. I'm trying to think. I was the chairman of the Yale Daily News in 1949, and I don't think there was a conservative since then, and which simply fortifies the general impression I have, which I recited a moment ago, that the critical community tends to gravitate in the direction of what is thought of as liberal or leftist in contemporary terms. Well, there has been a quarrel. It was very lively 20 years ago on whether we are properly a republic or a democracy. I tend to think that that quarrel tends to surrender simply to usage. People who want to be firm about it say, well, a republic understands that there's the public thing, res publica, and that there's therefore the non-public thing. By and large, to the extent that there is any agreement on the subject, it tends to be that republicanism, unlike democracy, acknowledges the limitations of the proper limitations of government power, and for that reason encourages government restraint. Every now and then somebody asks me for a copy of one of my books I don't have, and I have a lovely, ingenious lady, Karen Dobbins. She always finds them. I don't think there's any book there that you can't find. Well, you don't have to reconcile with a repository. Yale's been wonderful. They're just terrific about it. And you don't have to take an oath of allegiance to Yale to have them handle your papers. University library. Are we responsible for the Stalin-Hitler Pact? What scruple did Stalin have about human beings that Hitler didn't have? Any? Stalin dominated the foreign policy and domestic policy of the Soviet Union between 1924 and his death, 1953. And his legacy, unfortunately, continued many of those practices. It was a renunciation of Stalin by Khrushchev in 1956 that confirmed everything that we had always said about the Soviet Union. Not everything, but enough to justify what you call that crazy Cold War. They were bringing 289 bombs into Cuba. I just simply find this a fantasy, and regret that you stole on that. Sorry. Well, one more of my collections. What do you want me to say about it? She's my sister, but I would have to look at and see if there was anything. It's not a running quarrel to which we pay an enormous amount of attention, because it tends to be a factionalist. The rough understanding is that the Austrian school is more paradigmatic, by contrast with the British and Chicago school, which tends to take data and reason on the basis of what actually happens. So the influence of von Mises is enormous, but as a general social thinker, I think that of Hayek exceeds von Mises. Professor Vandenhoek here in New York, for instance, dismisses it. He says, von Mises is not a very good economist. You have to be a professional economist to be able to get away with saying that. But he was saying, what he's saying primarily is that he is a man who reasons from archetypes. And those archetypes are useful for paradigmatic reason, but not all that useful for simply plotting what to do. Well, I know a little Spanish and a little French, but that's all. I taught Spanish as a sophomore for 4 years. They were very short of Spanish teachers at Yale after the war. And I had gone to the University of Mexico before I went into the World War. So I've kept that it up a little bit. Well, that stuff is amusing journalistically. I don't think it survives. Nobody knows who Carlos Romero Barcelo is at this point. Oh, thank you. I never met Alger Hiss, and I thought Chambers was correct the moment the charge was made, in part because I thought there was an authenticity in his face and in his language, in part because I thought there was a horrible plausibility in what he said, by which I mean we knew there were spies. We didn't know how many there were until later, and it struck me as simply inconceivable that Whittaker Chambers would simply come up and make a charge that preposterous unless it were grounded in reality. Well, let's leave Clinton one side, shall we, because we've done that. I never said that Barry Goldwater was not a conservative. I wouldn't ever say that. I knew him very well, and what is correct about Barry Goldwater is that in the last 8 to 10 years of his life, he adjusted his position in such a way as to say, if the Supreme Court says so, then I go along. Now, this is a different position from what he adopted in his book, in his famous book on conservatism. And it has been said that that position was affected by his wife. His first wife died, and he remarried. I sat next to Mrs. Goldwater. I was the master of ceremonies at an affair in which Mrs. Thatcher was being given the annual Goldwater Award. This is the second Mrs. Goldwater. And she turned to me as we sat down to eat and said, who are your heroes? Who are your political heroes? I said, well, your husband and Ronald Reagan. I said, oh, I said, mine are Adlai Stevenson and Harry Truman. So I thought, well, you know, a case can be made for that. But it was odd to be hearing from the wife of Senator Goldwater at the celebration in honor of Mrs. Thatcher. What I'm simply saying is that what one hears about Goldwater in those last few years, that he wasn't, quote, a real conservative, had to do with positions that were traceable to his belief that the Supreme Court had sovereign authority to decide questions about gays in the military, questions about abortion, and so on. You put your finger on it because it's not what I had in mind as an expression of gratitude, i.e., I owe you this. Rather, it's a marketplace transaction in which the government keeps edging up what they're willing to pay in return for a year of your time. So I don't think it has caught the public imagination as a genuine attempt at reciprocity by the American young woman or man to the patrimony. We correspond a little bit. I don't think he's even started writing it, but he took a long time on the Whittaker Chambers book, and he took 6 or 7 years, I think, to write that. He's only been working on this one for a couple of years. Well, he has access to my papers at Yale, but anything he has access to is subject to my right to prohibit the publication. I give a lot of people access to those papers, scholars, but there's always the proviso that I must be shown what they want to publish. For instance, enormous life on James Burnham has just been completed, and there are about 20 or 30 communications between him and me, none of which I ended up vetoing, but if there was an entirely personal one of no historical interest, I would feel that a commitment to privacy would outweigh a scholarly right. I said I examined what he had said, and the charge that some of the things he had said were anti-Semitic, not fascist. The answer is yes, some of them were. Then I said, I don't happen to think he is. I think he's pretty much intrigued by the whole iconoclastic imperative. But who on earth heard me see he was fascist? Did I say that, Brian? So I apologize for it. Wait a minute, hang on. In the first place, we have had recurrently in the 20th century very, very bad people making very good points democratically. Hitler didn't have an absolute majority, but if you add the communists in that election, they were a majority. Perón had a majority time after time. So I don't think it's any obligation to say, because that person got a majority, therefore we have to be enthusiastic about his election. I think in the case of Austria, it is almost embarrassing, humiliating the length to which we have tried to frighten ourselves on the subject of Haidar. At the same time, Austria is where Hitler came from. And if there's a hypersensitivity on that general subject, maybe it's historically understandable. Bill Rutter was a former publisher of National Review. He was about 30 years, and he's a syndicated columnist in San Francisco. He is a 77. Well, treason is formally defined in the Constitution, and that's giving aid to the enemy. The law under which Rosenbergs were executed was not a law that had the word treason in it, but it was a law that levied a capital offense for anybody who expedited a flow of nuclear atomic information to anybody without authority. Treason is most often used metaphorically. You can say about somebody, well, he's really treasonable to the real ideas of America. It's loosely worded, and it's been an edgy word ever since Socrates was accused of treason, of misleading the youth. And there's a whole literature that focuses on how elusive that term is, given that Socrates was given a capital sentence as a result of his treasonable activities, which of course he explained was simply telling the youth the correct things. On the other hand, it's true that in doing so he violated protocols which were held rather gravely in Athens. And anyway, in the formal answer to your question is that treason is defined in the Constitution. Yeah, I have two or three idiosyncrasies. No, I think I only have two idiosyncrasies, and one of them is that I write only in red ink, and there actually is a reason for that. Which, if you have a lot of people editing a newspaper, magazine, as was the case with National Review, you don't want to worry about whose markings you're looking at. So I always use red. Wilmore Kendall always used green. And my other idiosyncrasy is that I perish from this earth if I don't have peanut butter for breakfast. When I have breakfast, it can vary from 6 to 8. But here, it must come with toast. But it can be an English muffin, or it can be a corn muffin, or as long as it's good, rough bread. And then there should be a little honey in it. But the bread should always also be buttered. Absolutely every day. About 40 years. Probably my natural attraction to the eternal verities. But I tell you, this will amuse you. I had a call from Don Rumsfeld, and he was the head of the board of trustees of Tuskegee Institute. He said, Bill, we're coming up on our 100th anniversary. Would you please write a column? So I thought, well, what am I going to write about Tuskegee? So I went to Encyclopedia, and that was where peanut butter was invented by George Washington Carver. So I wrote a column, and I said, I've never endeavored a piece of poetry in my entire life. But if I did, the first couple would be, I doubt that I shall ever see a poem lovely as Skippy's Peanut Butter. And then I went on to do my P into peanut butter. I got a heated letter from Charlton Heston. Say, no. It's not Skippy's, it's Planters, that's the best. And then an unidentified company approached and said, would you be willing to taste ours? We never put it on our label, but it's simply the best. It's called Red Wing, and it is the best. So that's what I always eat ever since then, Red Wing. You can't go out and say, give me some Red Wing. You have to find it, because if there was a store outside, there was a Lamb's Delicatessen, you might have Red Wing peanut butter, but it would be called Lamb's peanut butter. Well, I got a Rand problem, because it goes back a long way. When Atlas Shrugged was published, Whittaker Chambers reviewed it in National Review, and he gave it an absolutely scathing review. And as a result of that, Ayn Rand never consented to be in the same room with me. In fact, she would pre-establish that I hadn't been invited if there was some right-wing party to which she was also invited. But the division was a total. Ayn Rand is, of course, a materialist, and her ambition was to understand the world without any possibility of transcendence. The notion of altruism, she thought that was a dirty word, and her talisman was a dollar sign. And she tells a very good story, a very good yarn, and much that she did is admirable. But when she began confusing herself with God, she became unconvincing. So I very much regret her influence. Let me tell you something that I've never said before, but it's kind of funny. When that review was published, a lot of people who were pro-Rand wrote in. I remember one letter, because I recently was shown it, said, as a result of that terrible, hysterical, inexcusable review of Ayn Rand's book by Whittaker Chambers, I want you to cancel my subscription, never approach me again, signed Alan Greenspan. He was a Randite back then, a dear man. But that's how exercised people were as Randites back in 1957. You want me to start with that? Well, I decided to cross the Atlantic in my own sailboat in 1975, and I had a wonderful time. It's a terrific experience. 30 days, 6 of us, plus a crew that would feed us, and but we did all the sailing. So I sailed across, and then I did it again in Atlantic High. Then I sailed across the Pacific in racing through Paris. Then I sailed westward from Lisbon to Barbados in 1990. I had to, and I wrote books in each case to among other things, to finance the trip. Now, the question was about a canal. When the Panama Canal debate took place, and I was in favor of confirming the treaty, I was convinced after a trip to Panama that there were enough safeguards written into the treaty to authorize us to turn any situation around that became threatening. Then sort of bizarre ideas were floated about where else to, where this Buckley Canal is supposed to go. I have to be reminded, Arizona got into the picture, right? But I don't remember that was an alternative talked about at the time. The dependence on the canal, of course, diminishes with the age of air travel and general globalization, but I don't see any threat. The fact that a Chinese outfit figures in that traffic isn't particularly frightening. If we wanted to close up the canal, we could do so overnight, and we would have a right to do so if it threatened the integrity of the commerce. Well, thank you for asking the question. There are, by the way, 10 of them, in case you... Canterbury. Cumberland, sorry, Cumberland, yeah. Well, I wrote the first one in 1975. What happened was that my editor and 2 associates said they didn't want to have lunch with me. So I said, you know, always a pleasure. So we had lunch. But Blackford Oaks, the protagonist, goes from episode to episode, important dates in the Cold War. And the last one, he makes a final appearance just before the Berlin Wall comes down. So he's retired. Yes, I am. Yeah, but I've written 2, 3 since then. Did you say implications, or did you mean obligations? Well, what are the obligations? I think are always to try to understand what the contentions are, and try to ask the primary question: is this necessarily something that is done better by the government, or might it be done by the private sector? And if indeed it is best done by the government, is it best done by the federal government or by a smaller unit? I was in Minneapolis a couple of days ago, and of course, it discussed a federal program on doing something about literacy in Minneapolis. And I asked the various, what on earth has Washington, D.C. got to tell people in Minneapolis that they can't figure out for themselves about how to teach kids how to read? This is, I think, therefore, an obligation to ask yourself that question when social issues arise. About 2025, but I'm 2025. Sometimes not. I like a smaller audience, 800, around there, sort of chapel size. It's much easier to handle, I think. I prefer college campus. It's livelier, and by and large, if you have 800 people in a college audience, they're quite discriminatory. If they come to hear you, they want to hear you for whatever reason. By contrast, in a lot of other situations, it's a convention or whatever, they feel they have to go because they've subscribed to the series. So I don't mean sound invidious about the other audiences, because they can be terrific. But in answer to your question, I think you have more energy in a college age audience. Well, the best thing to read National Review. National Review devotes itself to the whole subject of the public scene, philosophically and politically, economically, constitutionally, and it publishes articles that are relevant, and also from time to time acknowledges important books. So that's given your initial interest, that's the way I would go, is to read that magazine and take hints from it. Oh, gee, Mr. Lamb, how can I do that? Well, in all the collections, there's a heavy dose of philosophy. In The Unmaking of a Mayor, there's an enormous infusion of the philosophy by which you are governed in making this or the other decision. That's true of Gratitude, it's true of the UN book. Well, now that's autobiographical. Cruising Speed is a book about a week in my life, i.e. from Sunday to Saturday. What actually did I do? What lectures did I give? What television shows did I, what letters did I answer? I've done 2 of those books, Cruising Speed and Overdrive. In any event, that would be a book primarily of interest to people with a biographical interest in the subject. It's rather an interesting format to write about 1 week rather than about your whole life. It was run in the New Yorker, as was the other one. My encounter with the late Malachi Martin was interrupted. He served briefly as a religion editor for the National Review. He was very eloquent, very learned. As you know, he was an ex-priest, an ex-Jesuit. But I thought he went a little over the deep end. And I haven't read the last half dozen of his books, which tended to involve Vatican plots. And whether Windswept was one of those or not, I simply don't know. But I don't think of him as a certain point as having been an entirely reliable critic. Wait a minute, that's not completely true. The overwhelming majority of the American people don't defend Aldous Hiss anymore, nor even the intellectuals. So it's not quite right to say that they're the same people. But I interrupted you, sorry. Well, that's good. I hope you never are. Overdrive was about a week in my life 10 years later, in 1980. Is that on my boat, maybe? Oh, it's limousine. Oh, it is limousine, yeah, limousine. Oh, sure I do. Now, the answer is I'm there, my doggy is there, my driver's there, my oh my goodness, they're both dead. Anyway, it was a scene of my movements, traveling from our house in the country to a place in New York, and with all the sort of the baggage that one ends up having to encounter if one's writing a column and having the editors for dinner, that kind of thing. It's a good question, and as one grows older, one reflects on certain things one's done in the past, which one would not do again, including a couple of adventures at sea. The extent to which seagoing experience comes in handy in other aspects of life is not uninteresting. And I think it's probably true that our experience at sea is extremely useful in showing the flip side of life. If you're out there and got nowhere to go, and there the storm is, and you got to stay up all night, you got to do it. And you can live for many years without ever facing that kind of extremity. So to the extent that the question asks, is it useful experience? The answer is yes, it is. This one here is 60 feet, 10. The longest stretch we ever did was from Bermuda to Barbados. To the Azores, which is 1,950 miles, 14 days. No. No, the answer is I did come close, yeah. Not on that particular trip, but taking my cutter to Bermuda one time, we ran into a hurricane, and that was a hairy experience. If we had been dismasted, it would have been a rough situation. Well, very interesting question, because a lot of it has to do with animal fatigue. We survived the first hurricane, and there were 6 of us on board, and all of a sudden, we thought we were going to hit Bermuda, and another storm came around, and nobody would eat. I mean, just nobody would eat, and that's a sign of demoralization. Wouldn't wash the dishes, and so I had read somewhere that if you serve, we had some hardtack and port. You can make somebody just bite into the hardtack and take a swig of port, and it begins to revive things. But you got to know to go in that direction. If everybody's demoralized simultaneously, then any possibility of ingenuity tends to dissipate. There are a lot of complaints that political correctness is stamping out certain impulses, often juvenile impulses, but impulses nevertheless, making it kind of risky to take an unorthodox position. I think it's Kenyan that has a very strict code of things that you mustn't offend women by doing this, or homosexuals by doing that, whatever. Now, whether that really amounts to a serious abridgment of freedom of expression at this point, I would hesitate to affirm. Well, I think there's a certain amount of ultramontanism going on with the current pope. There's accumulation of power, especially in doctrinal questions. But this business of what might Pius XII have done that he didn't do is a vexing question. I happened to have read over the weekend a long paper which accepted an interesting challenge. The author of it is a Monsignor in Stanford, and he took only references to the Pope in the New York Times, period, between 1939 and 1948. It was extraordinary accumulation of tributes to what the Pope did in this situation, that situation, to try to tilt the situation in that way. Now, whether he should have done a whole lot more is very hard to say. Well, you wouldn't expect that from me. I don't memorize viperish answers. If you have a huge article to contend with, and not much space to do it in, and plus legal restraints, you just got to manage as best you can. I've engaged in so many exchanges. This sounds self-serving, but let me say that in the 34 years that I did Firing Line, there was one exception. Nobody else ever complained about how he or she had been treated. Not one complaint. That's not bad for 34 years. I'm sure you haven't had any, but some people do. And this one particular professor who did complain, he was an anti-marijuana junkie. And he was mad that I didn't shut up the other guy who was taking a permissive position on marijuana. But so in these exchanges of which you singled out one, I don't think I have earned a reputation of being short or conclusory in an unfair way. On my desk at my office, National Review. Oh, that was on 35th Street. It's now on 33rd Street. It's another of my collections. I think in the 70s, in vain we will go, yeah. That was a 7-year-old daughter of a dear friend who died of cancer. Well, if memory serves, the people who were mad at Kazan were mad at him for testifying to a congressional committee. Am I correct? So this was what they were mad at him for, whereas that subject would not have come up in the question of the Polish anti-communists you're talking about. I'm glad to recall that although there was that flurry against Kazan, and some people stayed in their seats, finally they gave him an ovation when they gave him the award. I think the sailing books have sold the most, because it's hard to keep track of sales in soft cover. And then 4 or 5 of those were selections of the book club, and it's hard to count those just by the feel of it. Oh yeah. Oh heavens, yes. You mean if I didn't have other... Not really, no. Not that lucrative, no. But in answer to the latter question, I think I think that the omnipresence of data, of news, have to have some effect. The speed of communication, the number of messages that will be given. One likes to think that the internet will turn people on who had sort of stopped writing letters if they ever did so, because it's so easy and so tempting. On the first question you raised, I was, when I ran for mayor, I was in favor of continuing to outlaw drugs. I changed that position, not because I have an incipient enthusiasm for drugs, but because I concluded that the war against them was simply not working, and that the casualties of that war overcame the casualties of the drugs themselves. So that's the one major point on which in the last few years I've come around. Again, I stress for utilitarian reasons, not for ideological reasons. Well, I felt the need in 1971, I think it was, to face 4 questions that were being widely discussed and try to say something useful about them. Education and crime, and what were the others? Welfare and taxation. There's nothing in there that embarrasses me at this point, I'm glad to say. And it was reviewed very prominently by Pat Moynihan in the New York Times, and he ended up agreeing with about half of it, which is not bad. Yes, I have read the book. It's a wonderful book, and terrifying. What the author, his extraordinary capacity in giving life to a storm is really memorable. The first question was what again? Remind me. Well, I've written a book called Nearer My God, in which the subject is raised. I think it was expertly put by Newman. One cannot deny miracles, but has no reason to expect one. So that if you take your ailing self to Lourdes, which I will be doing at the end of this month, you mustn't expect to come back with all of your sinuses working. But it is wrong to suppose that it can't happen. So I think that the divine intervention is an attribute of the Godhead. I.e., I would not permit myself to deny that God can do what he wants to do, but I must never expect that he will do so, not even for the football team at Dallas or whatever it is that is now being disputed before the Supreme Court. Well, I've been there once before, and it's simply a devotional exercise. It's a 2 or 3 days in which you are very vigorously exposed to people feeling the balm of hope and of succor, where people pray, and all these cripples come from all over the world. And statistically, they don't have, they've only been filming like 52 certified miracles. By certified, I mean that they've actually withstand the toughest intellectual and scientific scrutiny and are affirmed as having been miracles. But it's the atmosphere is just memorable. Nobody, in my experience, leaves there without feeling better. And that justifies even that long trip, 3 days. I'm sorry I can't, because I just don't know, or don't have enough of a feel for her. I haven't read Professor Lucas's that particular book, but I'm aware of the criticism. In fact, I responded to it in a brief piece in the National Interest. John Lucas tends to have had sort of a reflexive opposition to what he considers to be formalistic anti-communist conventions. And he's a very original guy, and he's always dissatisfied with any formulation that pleases 3 other people. It's got to be completely individual to satisfy him. Well, I knew him when he was at law school at Yale, and I was teaching Spanish, and he was very active in the World Federalist movement. I didn't really get to experience him until 1968, when in the Chicago Convention, he, in my judgment, behaved with considerable maturity. He was running for Congress. In fact, he was elected. And he was so appealing, so bright, such a good sport, such a marvelous sense of humor, that I ended up actually urging his election. I was asked, how could I engage in such an act of heterodoxy? To which my answer was self-indulgence. I had no other excuse for it. I was asked to be one of the elegists. I was one of 7 people who expressed our grief. I had seen him rather recently in Switzerland, because he was the ambassador to Human Rights Committee in Geneva towards the end. Then he had this terrible creature who he was deranged, and he had a sense of it that Allard was giving him instructions via a gold thing in his mouth, that he had to go and stamp him out. I've been to a lot of funerals, but it's very seldom, I can't remember another in which grief was so palpable as at Allard's funeral. People just truly loved Allard Lowenstein. Yeah, it's a wonderful question. What I remember most keenly about the confusion with which that word is used is a little line in the New York Times about 35 years ago. They use the word conservative communists, meaning the most Stalinist, i.e. the most conservative in the sense of not wanting to change in the Khrushchev direction. And this particular line says that conservative communists have become so preponderant in the Kremlin that orders have come out forbidding the importation of the conscience of a conservative by Goldwater. So there you had a marvelous collision of those 2 words. The Stalinists are against the importation of the conscience of a conservative by Goldwater. Now, the conservatives, the word conservatives is used properly as an adjective, even though it's distracting. You can say the conservative socialists in that particular conclave came out against the proposal of Mr. Harrison. And the word is used in the same way that a moderate is used, a moderate Republican, a moderate Democrat, meaning more towards the center. But to define the word itself is, do you know Richard Weaver's definition of conservatism? Richard Weaver was professor of English at Chicago. Very shy guy. And in one seminar, he was pressed to define conservatism. And he kept saying, no, you can't do it. Finally, I said, well, conservatism is a paradigm of essences towards which the phenomenology of the world is in continuing approximation. You like that? Well, we published an important piece in National Review in 1955-56 by Isabel Patterson. She was a book editor for the Herald Tribune and had an important reputation as a libertarian philosopher. The God of the Machine was her book, and she was firm in all of her opinions, but especially firm on the matter of reading. She said, you've got to learn how to read when you're 4 years old. If you wait until late 5, you lose the possibility of cultivating your memory. I don't know whether this is true or not, but she said it so impressively that it's always stayed in my mind. I happen to have a terrible memory, And I wonder, was I 6 or 7 before I could read? I don't know. But I think it's probably true that to learn very early, as this lady did, gives you certain powers which might otherwise be fleeting. And it is disastrous what a terrible time we are doing in breeding literacy. It's mostly because I'm beaten down by my right-wing theorists and intellectual friends. They always find something wrong with a single tax idea. What I'm talking about, Mr. Lamb, is Henry George, who said, look, there's infinite capacity to increase capital and to increase labor, but none to increase land. And since wealth is a function of how they play against each other, land should be thought of as common property. The effect of this would be that if you have a parking lot and the Empire State Building next to it, the tax on the parking lot should be the same as the tax on the Empire State Building, because you shouldn't encourage land speculation. Anyway, I've run into tons of situations where I think the single tax theory would be applicable. We should remember also this about Henry George. He was sort of co-opted by the socialists in the 20s and in the 30s, but he was not one at all. Albert J. Nock's book on him makes that plain. Plus also, he believed in only that tax. He believed in zero income tax. No, those are definitions taken from my text. Yeah, that's the whole idea of that book, to take words that have been used and supply the context in which it was used. Aracakininophobia. Aracakininophobia, yeah. Somebody told me that it exists, and I've never looked at it. I'm sure it's not in any dictionary we have. I don't have a definitive position. I was very much influenced by Ogden, and very much influenced by Joe Sobran, who also wrote a book on it. On the other hand, how do you get around the eternal fact that he died in, Oxford died in what, 07, 06, 07, and King Lear, and I think Romeo, and another big play appeared 2, 3, 4 years later. And Shakespeare died in 1616. Now the Oxfordians have an elaborate explanation that he wrote these, but he stipulated they only be sort of eased out after they had been sort of a lull in the appearance of his last day. Is not. However, the etymological case, the poetic case, is very striking, by which I mean that Oxford did write like Shakespeare. If I'm interrupting Sophie, my marvelous Sophie, because she's a great, famous translator. She lives in the Columbia area. The book is once again another collection, and in those collections, I stick in articles I wrote that I think have perennial interest, and some columns, and some of those snatches from the magazine that you pulled out a few moments ago. Well, they're both brilliant writers. Florence King, of course, writes for every issue of National Review, and she classifies herself as a terribly self-satisfied misogynist. She says, I never could understand why people consider that solitary confinement is a punishment. And Camille Paglia is, again, an extremely brilliant writer. One has, at least I have the feeling about Camille Paglia, that the lure of iconoclasm is devastating with it. She sometimes takes a position, or at least that's my feel of it, because it's so shocking, involving sex, involving everything. Whereas I think with Florence King, there's kind of obstinate, she would hate this word, lovable, convincing tenacity. Absolutely fits. And my fascination for her and my devotion to her almost requires that remoteness. No. But we exchange emails. Always sign it love, and she signs hers love, and then we berate the rest of mankind. Yes, on her books, there's a picture of her. Yeah, and if you send me the address, I'll be glad to write a test for you. It's 215 Lexington Avenue, New York, 10016. You know, of course, if you have a internet, they'll give you the zip code for any address. Oh, I settled for my wife, my son, and one of my sisters. Well, and earlier on, somebody asked about National Review's guide to colleges, 100 good colleges. That would be something worth consulting in your situation. But here's something to remember. In any college, in any university, there's always going to be more there to learn than any individual can possibly learn. So that the challenge becomes to select in that college either something that's congruent with its general tradition or individual people. When Peter Abelard was teaching in France, people would go, they decide to go depending on where he was teaching. Now, our big name professors aren't that ambulatory, but they do help build a reputation. If one wants, for instance, classical economics, you probably want to go to the University of Chicago because they have an illustrious faculty there. But I repeat, anywhere you go, they're going to be much more scholarship than you can possibly imbibe, so that the challenge therefore becomes the student to seek it out and cultivate the processes of discrimination. You can't, at least I can't, decide what at any given moment that far away would be needed to say. I believe there are certain imperishable things. God is not mocked, and the church will exist. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. To what extent that would be a newsworthy statement in the year 2050, I don't know. Von Mises simply refused to give it up, so did Hayek. Though Hayek went towards Whiggishness towards the end because he surrendered on liberalism. Liberalism was defined, I kid you not, in Woodrow Wilson's book, as the history of man's efforts to confine the strength of government. 25 years later, Santayana said the only thing the modern liberal is interested in liberating is man from his marriage contract. And thus quickly had the history, the definition of liberalism traveled even in 30 or 40 years. It's pretty much now a lost word in the original sense of being an effort to restrain government. And one has to keep that in mind in using it. Well, that book was put together by my editor, Sam Vaughan. What he decided to put in it was anything I had written about the use of the English language, plus also that supplementary business of 1,000 words as used by me and their definition. There's some pretty interesting stuff in that collection. It includes a few reviews I've done for the New York Times and others. Well, Mr. Teller's not dead that I know of. I know him. I've known him moderately well, and I absolutely revere him. I think he's a tower of strength, a great human being. Shevardnadze I know nothing about other than his narrative as an important Russian figure in the New York Times, so I can't say anything interesting about him, I'm sorry to say. Well, in the first place, it's not that prodigious. When they kicked up the idea of having a calendar with words I use is sort of unusual, they ran out after 3 years. So that means there's only 1,000 words that could conceivably be thought of as unusual. If you want a really prodigious, look at anything by Updike, for instance. In one book of his, I think there were 26 words that I had never laid eyes on. But by and large, it's safe to say this: an unusual word is defined as a word you don't know, and an unusual word you define as one that I don't know. Each person has an odd little stock of words that he sort of appropriates, and what is true is that I tend to use words that I know, whereas a lot of people tend to sort of tuck them into their collection and don't use them so frequently. That's probably what gives me an undeserved reputation. The idea was to do something on New Year's Eve, and I had a commission to write a book. It's a kind of a fun book about this this kid and how he taps into a magic voice. I was told by the publisher a children's book has to have a suspense. It has to have narrative, and it has to be a moral end to it. And those are the only three ingredients I was given, which is really all you need. No, when I ran for mayor, I made a universal statement that people shouldn't identify with any particular ethnic or social group, whether labor unions or management or Italians and that was got a little exposure. I think I ended up going to that parade anyway for the sake of it. Sorry. Go to the bathroom.